The hidden supervolcano. Threatening 500,000 people, why Campi Flegrei is more dangerous than Yellowstone. It was a morning in May 2024 when the Earth reminded Pozzuoli that patience has limits. The ground trembled with a force that hadn't shaken these streets in 40 years. A magnitude 4. 4 earthquake, struck beneath the city at dawn, powerful enough to send residents stumbling from their beds and families rushing into narrow coastal streets in panic. It wasn't the strongest earthquake that region had ever experienced, but it arrived with a message that resonated far beyond the 9. 2 magnitude on the local scale. The director of the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology in Naples looked at the seismic readings and made a statement that cut through all the scientific language. 2 of the most recent earthquakes are the strongest we've ever seen. Oh, this wasn't academic observation. This was alarm dressed in careful words. Within hours of that May earthquake, engineers were flooding into neighborhoods, marking doorways and stairwells with chalk to indicate which were safe and which had become death traps. Families who had lived in their homes for generations were sleeping in cars parked in courtyards. Schools were shuttered and inspected for structural damage. And somewhere beneath the feet of these 500,000 people, something restless was still moving. But this is not the volcano story you have heard before. For decades, the volcano everyone fears sits under Wyoming, famous before it erupts, studied before it threatens, sitting in the back of the American imagination like a clock that could end everything. The scientists who actually spend their lives studying volcanic systems will tell you something that never makes the documentary trailer. Yellowstone is being watched by more instruments than almost any other place on Earth. The magma beneath it is mostly frozen solid rock, and the chance of it erupting in your lifetime is smaller than the chance of being struck by falling space debris. The volcano that genuinely keeps volcanologists awake is on the other side of the Atlantic, sitting directly beneath a Mediterranean metropolis where 500,000 people are raising children, running businesses, going to sleep every night inside the crater of a supervolcano that is actively restless and awake right now. Its name is Campi Flegrei, the burning fields. For thousands of years, the people living here have called it that because they could see what the Romans knew and what the Greeks understood before them. The ground breathes. Steam hisses out of the soil. Lakes sit in strange circular depressions. Sulfurous smoke rises from craters that have no name because they exist in 1,000 places across the caldera. The ancient world looked at these signs and decided this was the doorway to the underworld, the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead. They were not being superstitious. They were describing a live volcanic system breathing beneath their feet with the only language they possessed. What they could not see was that they were not standing next to a volcano. They were standing inside one. Campi Flegrei is not a single mountain with a single peak, the way you imagine a volcano. It is a caldera, a vast bowl-shaped depression, roughly 12 to 15 kilometers across, formed when the roof of an enormous magma chamber collapsed inward after erupting. It is the largest active caldera in Europe, and unlike a lonely peak in the wilderness, this bowl is filled with people. The city of Pozzuoli sits at its center. The western neighborhoods of Naples spill across its rim. Towns, ports, apartment blocks, schools, and highways cover nearly every inch of it. Italian authorities draw a red zone across the most dangerous part of the caldera, the area most exposed to pyroclastic flows in an eruption. Inside that red zone live roughly 500,000 people. 500,000 human beings going to work, raising children, sleeping at night directly on top of the throat of a supervolcano. Now, to understand why this place behaves the way it does, you need to understand one word that is the key to everything happening right now. Bradyseism. It comes from Greek roots, meaning slow movement, and it describes something almost no other volcano on Earth does so dramatically. The ground at Campi Flegrei rises and falls, not in an earthquake, not in seconds, but slowly over months and years, like the chest of something enormous breathing beneath the city. When magma and hot gas and superheated fluids push up into the shallow crust, the whole surface swells and lifts. When that pressure eases, the ground sinks back down. This has been happening for thousands of years. The Romans left behind the clearest evidence of this that exists anywhere in the world. On the ruins of an ancient Roman market in Pozzuoli, the standing marble columns are pockmarked with holes bored by marine mollusks, the kind that only live underwater. That means those columns, built on dry land, sank low enough over the centuries to be submerged beneath the sea and then rose back up into the open air. The ground did not shift a little. It rose and fell by meters, carrying a Roman marketplace up and down like a slow tide made of stone over 2,000 years. That is bradyseism. That is the signature of a restless giant beneath the city. After a long, quiet slumber, bradyseism has come roaring back. To feel why the current unrest is so serious, you have to know what happened the last time this ground moved with real violence, because the people of Pozzuoli remember it, and it is the closest thing we have to a warning written in living memory. The modern chapters of unrest began quietly. There was uplift from 1950 to 1952. There was more from 1969 to 1972. But then came the crisis that changed everything, the 2 years that Naples still talks about. Between 1982 and 1984, the ground beneath Pozzuoli rose by roughly 1.8 meters. Let that number land, because it is not a figure on a chart. It is the Earth lifting an entire seaside city almost 6 feet into the air over 2 years. 6 feet. Cracking foundations, splitting walls, buckling streets, jamming door frames so that doors no longer close properly. The harbor rose so much that boats could no longer dock the way they had for generations. Ships that had been berthed in the same spots for centuries suddenly sat high and dry. More than 16,000 earthquakes struck during that crisis, a relentless battering ram of seismic energy that never seemed to end. The strongest reached a local magnitude of about 4 in October of 1983, powerful enough to send people running into the streets in the dark, fleeing from their homes in panic. The Italian government made a decision that tells you exactly how seriously they took it. They evacuated the historic heart of Pozzuoli and permanently relocated around 40,000 residents to a newly built town on higher ground called Monte Roello. 40,000 people moved out of their homes. Not because the volcano erupted, not because magma reached the surface, not because pyroclastic flows destroyed everything in sight, but because the ground itself had become too dangerous to live on. The buildings were cracking, the infrastructure was failing, the very foundation of existence was becoming unstable beneath their feet. The harbor that had served the city for centuries became unusable. No eruption ever came. The uplift eventually stopped. The ground settled and life crept back toward normal. But the lesson was carved into the city. This is not a dead landscape. It is a sleeping one, and it does not sleep peacefully. Which brings us to the reason scientists are watching this caldera with an intensity they reserve for very few places on Earth. Since around 2005, the ground has been rising again. And this time it has not stopped. It has accelerated. At Rione Terra, the ancient rocky heart of Pozzuoli and the point where the caldera deforms the most, the ground has climbed by well over 1.5 meters since that new phase began. Roughly 140 to 150 centimeters of uplift, with a significant share of that occurring in just the last couple of years. In some recent stretches, the surface has been rising by a few centimeters every single month. In the most active periods in 2023 and 2024, the acceleration reached 15 millimeters every month. That is not gradual change. That is rapid transformation of a landscape. With the swelling comes the shaking. In 2024, the largest earthquake of the sequence struck on the 20th of May at magnitude 4. 4, one of the strongest tremors the area had felt in 4 decades. In 2025, the caldera produced at least 5 separate earthquakes above magnitude 4, with the largest reaching a duration magnitude of about 4. 6. These are not distant, deep events happening far beneath the city where they can be ignored. They are shallow, right beneath the streets, close enough that residents describe furniture jumping and plaster falling from ceilings. Some describe the particular sound of it, a deep underground boom, a fraction of a second before the jolt arrives. So the whole city has learned to flinch in the same instant. Here is a detail that shows just how alive the system truly is. When researchers, including teams working with scientists at Stanford University, applied machine learning algorithms to comb back through the raw seismic recordings from 2022 to 2025, the number of detectable earthquakes exploded from around 12,000 cataloged events to more than 54,000. 54,000 distinct earthquake signatures that the traditional monitoring systems had missed. The caldera was shaking far more constantly than even the most sensitive instruments had first revealed, a constant trembling beneath the city that most residents could not feel but that the machines never missed. That same analysis traced out a thin, sharp, ring-shaped fault beneath the surface, the structural scar of the old collapsed caldera, now the exact seam along which the ground is breaking as it lifts upward. When researchers at Stanford used laboratory experiments to simulate what was happening beneath Pozzuoli, they set up what they called a mocha pot model, cleverly mimicking the stovetop espresso maker that heats fluid under pressure. A heated lower chamber represented a geothermal reservoir pushing fluid into a cracked lid made of materials matching those found beneath Campi Flegrei. What they discovered is that much of the current activity may not be driven by rising magma at all, but by pressure buildup from water and vapor in the geothermal reservoir itself. This changes how scientists interpret the data, but does not make the volcano harmless. It simply makes it a different kind of dangerous, one where pressure, not molten rock, becomes the enemy. This is not an abstraction to the people who live there. When the strongest swarms hit, life in Pozzuoli bends around them. Schools have been closed and inspected for cracks in their walls and ceilings. Families have carried mattresses down into cars and courtyards to sleep away from walls they no longer trust. Engineers have gone building to building, marking which stairwells are safe and which are not. Some residents have left for good, Many cannot because their homes, their work, and their entire lives are inside the caldera, and there is nowhere obvious to go. That is the quiet daily weight of living on a volcano that will not sit still. The Italian authorities have not ignored any of this. Campi Flegrei currently sits under a yellow alert, an intermediate level that signals meaningful change in the volcanic risk without triggering the pre-evacuation that a higher orange or red phase would demand. The National Civil Protection Department has drawn up and repeatedly updated a national emergency plan built around a single staggering logistical problem. How do you move 500,000 people out of a red zone quickly, safely, before an eruption that may give you only days of clear warning? The plan pairs the caldera towns with host regions across Italy that would take in the evacuees. It is one of the largest volcanic evacuation blueprints anywhere in the world. They have rehearsed pieces of it in exercises. In 2019, a major national exercise called Campi Flegrei tested procedures. In 2024, due to the escalation of the bradyseismic crisis since September of 2023, 3 additional exercises were conducted. The first 2, held in April and June, evaluated rapid emergency planning procedures for the bradyseismic area. The third, from October 9 to 12, tested the full National Volcanic Risk Plan. No one has ever tested it at full scale because no one has ever had to. Now put the 2 supervolcanoes side by side, Yellowstone and Campi Flegrei. The contrast is the entire point, and it is where most people get the danger exactly backward. Yellowstone last produced a true super eruption around 640,000 years ago in an event called the Lava Creek eruption, a magnitude 8 on the volcanic explosivity index, throwing out more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of material. On pure destructive sealing, Yellowstone is the larger monster. There is no contest. If Yellowstone ever fully erupted at that scale again, it would be a continental catastrophe, but that is the wrong measure of danger. The United States Geological Survey, which monitors Yellowstone more closely than almost any volcano in history, estimates the annual odds of a super eruption there at roughly 1 in 730,000. The magma chamber beneath it is mostly solid, crystallized rock, not the churning ocean of liquid lava the movies imagine. There are no signs of an impending eruption, and any large one would announce itself with weeks to months of unmistakable warning. Intensifying quakes, accelerating uplift, changing gases, all of it caught by instruments that blanket the park like a nervous system of constant surveillance. Yellowstone is a giant, but it is a sleeping giant that is being watched every second and is showing no intention of waking. Campi Flegrei is a smaller giant that is already stirring, already lifting the ground, already cracking the streets, and it is doing all of it underneath the homes of 500,000 people. That is the difference. The danger of a volcano is never just how big it could get. It is how awake it is, how close it sits to human beings, and how little room those human beings have to run. On every one of those measures, the burning fields under Naples are the more frightening address. To understand what an eruption here could actually mean, you do not have to reach back 600,000 years. You only have to reach back to 1538, because Campi Flegrei has erupted once in recorded history, and the story is a warning in itself. In the years before it, the ground around Pozzuoli had been rising, exactly the kind of bradyseism the region is showing today. Then, on the 29th of September 1538, the earth tore open near the coast and began to erupt. It lasted only about a week. In that single week, it built an entirely new mountain from nothing, a cinder cone roughly 100 meters high that stands to this day. They named it plainly Monte Nuovo, the new mountain. Villages were buried. The coastline was reshaped. And by the standards of great eruptions, this was a small one. A relatively minor one-week eruption from this caldera was still powerful enough to raise a 500-year-old hill out of flat ground and bury settlements whole. Now imagine that same event not in the sparsely populated coast of the 16th century, but underneath a modern metropolitan region packed with apartment towers, highways, hospitals, and 500,000 people. That is why even a modest eruption at Campi Flegrei is treated as a serious threat. Scientists have estimated that even a moderate eruption here, a level 3 on the volcanic explosivity scale, could dust as many as 2. 5 million people across the Naples region with at least a couple of centimeters of ash. Enough to collapse roofs, foul water, ground aircraft, and choke a densely built city. The most dangerous product of all would be the pyroclastic flow, and this is the thing the red zone is drawn to escape. A pyroclastic flow is not lava. It is a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas, ash, and rock that races downhill at highway speeds, at temperatures that can exceed several hundred degrees. It is what destroyed Pompeii just across the bay in a single afternoon in the year 79. There is no outrunning one. The only defense is to already be gone before it forms. Researchers believe that an eruptive column from Campi Flegrei could rise some 18 miles into the sky, spreading ash across vast distances on the wind. There's a detail about this stretch of coast that makes it almost unique on Earth and far more dangerous than either volcano alone. The Bay of Naples does not have one supervolcano watching over it. It has two. On the eastern side of the city stands Vesuvius, the mountain that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum in the year 79, still active, still capable, with millions living on its flanks. On the western side sits Campi Flegrei, the sprawling hidden caldera beneath the city. Between them in the middle sits Naples itself, one of the great historic cities of the Mediterranean, home to around 3 million people in its wider metropolitan area, wedged directly between two of the most closely watched volcanic systems in the world. There are very few places on the planet where so many people live so tightly between two giants that have both, in human memory and human history, shown exactly what they can do. It is a concentration of risk that has no real equal, and it is why Italian volcanology is among the most advanced on Earth. They did not build that expertise out of curiosity. They built it out of necessity. The reason serious volcanologists watch this place so closely is not because they believe it is more likely to erupt than it was 10 years ago. It is because of the appalling mismatch between the hazard and the exposure. Yellowstone could stage a monstrous eruption, and because of where it sits, threaten far fewer lives in the immediate blast zone than a comparatively small eruption at Campi Flegrei would, simply because Campi Flegrei has a city of 500,000 people standing in the crater. This is the distinction that separates careful science from clickbait. So let us ask the honest question, the one you should be asking. Is Campi Flegrei about to erupt? Is this the beginning of the big one? The honest scientific answer is no. No eruption is expected. Let me say that again clearly because it matters. There is no eruption forecast, no imminent blast, no date. The current unrest, as violent as it feels to the people living through the shaking, is not proof that magma is about to reach the surface. The single most likely outcome of the current phase is more of exactly what is already happening. More uplift, more earthquakes, and eventually, as in the 1980s, a slowing, a settling, and a return to uneasy quiet with no eruption at all. That is the most probable path. But a simple no is not the whole story, and the nuance is where the real danger lives. Several things here are genuinely changing, and they raise the stakes even if an eruption never comes. The first is the shaking itself. You do not need a volcanic eruption to get hurt at Campi Flegrei. You just need the earthquakes. The tremors driven by this uplift are shallow, striking a dense, historic city where many buildings were never engineered for repeated seismic stress. A magnitude 4 earthquake almost anywhere else is a minor event. A magnitude 4 directly beneath old, crowded, brittle housing over and over month after month is a slow structural emergency. The second thing that is changing is the trajectory of the volcanic system itself. The uplift is not just continuing at a steady pace. It has been accelerating, speeding up with each passing year, and the caldera is now sitting at a higher elevation than at any point since that frightening 1980s crisis when the city was nearly abandoned. The system is being loaded with energy, not relieved of it, like a spring wound tighter and tighter with no release valve. The third and most important piece is the one people get backward in their thinking. The reason serious volcanologists watch this place so closely is not because they believe an eruption is imminent or happening tomorrow. It is because of the appalling mismatch between the hazard and the exposure. Yellowstone could stage a continental catastrophe and threaten far fewer lives immediately simply because of where it sits, isolated in a wilderness with sparse population. While a small eruption at Campi Flegrei would threaten millions of people across the Naples region, what the instruments are measuring is real. The ground is rising. The earthquakes are multiplying. Those are facts about the present, and they are not in dispute. What no one can hand you is a prediction, a date, or a promise about what comes next, because that is not a measurement. It is a guess. And anyone telling you the guess is selling you fear. The volcano is awake. That is true. That it will erupt on any particular timeline is not something science can claim. So what happens next in practical terms? The answer for now is watching, and an enormous amount of it. Campi Flegrei is monitored around the clock by the Italian National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology through its Vesuvius Observatory, one of the oldest volcano observatories on Earth. They track the earthquakes in real time. They measure the uplift down to the millimeter with satellites and ground sensors. They sample the gases venting from the Solfatara crater, the steaming sulfur-choked heart of the caldera, watching the chemistry for any sign that fresh magma is rising rather than just hot fluids shifting. The alert level can be raised from yellow to orange to red as the picture changes, and each step carries defined actions up to and including the staged evacuation of the red zone. If you live in or near the Campi Flegrei red zone or near Vesuvius across the bay, the most important thing you can do costs nothing. Know your zone and know your route. Learn which evacuation area you are assigned to under the Civil Protection Plan and how you would get there without a car because the roads may be jammed or broken. Keep a small bag ready with documents, medication, water, and essentials, so that if the alert is ever raised, you are moving in minutes, not searching through drawers. Talk to the people you live with about where you would meet if the phones go down, because in any real crisis, the networks jam within the first hour. Take the drills seriously when they come, because the difference between an orderly evacuation and a deadly one is almost never the volcano. It is whether people moved when they were asked. Here is the final thought to carry forward. We tend to rank volcanoes the way we rank monsters, by size, by the worst thing they could theoretically do. And by that measure, Yellowstone will always win the headline in the horror film. But that is not how danger actually works. A giant that is fast asleep, watched by every instrument we own in the middle of a wilderness, is not the thing that will hurt you. The thing that will hurt you is the smaller giant that is already moving, already breathing the ground up and down, already cracking the walls of the houses built on its back with 500,000 people living between it and the sky. The most dangerous volcano is almost never the most powerful one. It is the awake one with a city on its shoulders. Campi Flegrei has been sleeping and stirring under Naples for tens of thousands of years, long before the Romans called it the doorway to the underworld, and it will still be there long after all of us are gone. We cannot switch it off. We cannot make it erupt on schedule or promise that it never will. The only thing that has ever been in human hands is the same thing it is today, whether the people living on top of it are watching, warned, and ready to move the moment the earth tells them to.